So it's a great injustice, and yes, I mean, I think it's certainly one of the main stains on our justice system, and it is an embarrassment both nationally and internationally.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Richard Garside talks about the IPP prison sentence.
If you've been sent to prison for 2 years, you're still in prison 17 years on, there's something badly wrong about that.
And why the former Supreme Court Justice called it the greatest stain on our criminal justice system.
One of the great unfairnesses of the IPP sentence is it's never really over. It just keeps going on and on and on.
Richard says after release, IPP prisoners can be locked up again for minor reasons.
An IPP prisoner who was finding it very difficult to adjust to life outside, as a lot of prisoners, particularly when they've been in prison for a long time, find. And he told his probation officer, I'm struggling a bit here. I'm really kind of finding it very difficult. My mental health isn't very good at the moment. That was enough to get him recalled to prison.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Richard Garside, Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Richard, welcome to the show. The former Supreme Court Justice Lord Browne described the IPP sentence as the single greatest stain on our criminal justice system. And can you explain to us what IPP is and why he would describe it as such?
Well, yes, so the IPP, it stands for Imprisonment for Public Protection. And I think the easiest way of thinking about it is that it's like a life sentence, but just for the kinds of offences that wouldn't attract a life sentence. So we're not talking generally about murder or manslaughter, which already attract a life sentence. And if you've committed those kinds of offences and been found guilty, then you would expect certainly a very long sentence and potentially a life sentence. The IPP is different because it can be given, or it's no longer available, but it was given for a range of offences, which some of them could be relatively serious, say a serious violence offence, but sometimes for relatively minor offences. And the difference between those kinds of offence or those kinds of sentences, the IPP sentence, and a standard sentence is there is, in principle, no end point. So you can go into prison, the judge might say, I'm sending you to prison for 2 years. At the end of those 2 years, you can apply for release, but you may not be released. And one of the things we've seen with the IPP is many people who are in prison for years and years after the time originally set by the judge, 5, 10, 15 years and more. And so it's a great injustice, and yes, I mean, I think it's certainly one of the main stains on our justice system, and it is an embarrassment both nationally and internationally that although the sentence has now been formally abolished back in 2012, and we may talk a bit more about that in a while, it continues, the shadow continues to be held over many, many prisoners who remain in prison to this day.
So IPP started in 2003 and, as you said, abolished in 2012. Why are we talking about it now in 2025?
Well, there's broadly speaking two reasons why there are people still in prison under the IPP. There's a group of prisoners who've never been released. So they may have been originally given, say, a 2 or 3 year sentence, 10, 12, 15 years on. They were never able to persuade the authorities that they should be released, and they remain languishing in prison.
So they haven't necessarily committed more offences, but
no, they haven't. No, they've just never been released.
Wow.
And then there's another group who, having been released, have been sent back to prison. Sometimes because they've committed a further offence, sometimes because maybe they've just breached the terms of their, what's called the licence, the kind of the terms of their release. And sometimes that can be for relatively minor, relatively petty matters. It's not necessarily committed a serious crime. They may have missed a series of appointments, for example. So that's the other reason. It's people who've been released but then get sucked back into the system. And one of the great unfairnesses of the IPP sentence is it's never really over. It just keeps going on and on and on. Now, there have been some important reforms over the last few months that will reduce the likelihood of people being unnecessarily returned to prison, but nonetheless it is still possible. So you've got that cohort of prisoners who've never been released, and then that cohort who, having been released, then get sent back to prison.
Do you have any idea of the numbers of that?
Well, broadly speaking, in terms of the never released, it's something of the order of about 1,000 prisoners, something of that nature. And then in terms of those who've been released but then keep coming back, that's about another 1,500 or so. So in total, it's about 2,500 to 3,000 prisoners currently in prison under an IPP sentence, either because they've never been released or because, having been released, they've been returned to prison.
You mentioned that the IPP is originally for crimes that don't quite merit a mandatory life sentence. Do you have some examples of some of the lower level offences that have got people into the system?
In one sense, they're quite ridiculous and almost farcical, but they're actually also very tragic because they're about real people and their lives. So, the case of someone sent to prison for 2 years for mobile phone theft. They're still in prison 12 years on, by which stage they've developed psychosis and all sorts of issues around mental health because they've just given up and are just in despair. Somebody who's sent to prison originally for 4 years for a motor theft offence. 6 years on, they're in such despair they've killed themselves. Someone else who was sent to prison for 2 years for GBH, so that's gross, bodily harm. It's a serious violence offence, but nonetheless, 2 years, 17 years on, they're still in prison, they've given up all hope and they've killed themselves. So those are some of the examples of individuals where I think most members of the public would say, yeah, if you've committed an offence, you should get the sentence that the court decides is appropriate. And indeed, I speak to family members of IPP prisoners who don't dispute that their family member did something wrong and they were rightly punished for it, but they simply can't understand why, after a 2-year period that the judge says that's really your punishment, you're still in prison, 4 years on, 8 years on, 12 years on, 18 years on. And it's a great injustice because it brings the whole justice system into disrepute. Because if it's not seen to be fair and it's not seen to be treating people fairly, then I think even members of the public who may be naturally very punitive or retributive in their mentality and think we just need to send people to prison for a long time. But even then, I think they would generally get that, if you've been sent to prison for 2 years, you're still in prison 17 years on, there's something badly wrong about that.
If you are sent to prison for 2 years, you're still in prison 17 years later, it would be an enormous pressure on a person. Are there a lot of suicides and mental health problems amongst these IPP prisoners?
Well, we do know that a number of IPP prisoners have killed themselves in custody. It's something of the order of 100. I mean, it's a bit difficult to estimate that. And it does seem to be a higher rate of suicide than the general prison population. And the general prison population has a higher rate of suicide than the general population at large. You also have, issues of self-harm and sometimes some quite significant issues of self-harm. Within the last few months, an IP prisoner set himself on fire in his cell because he was in such despair. So there can be some quite serious incidents of self-harm. And then, of course, there's just general issues around mental health, and despair. And, individual prisoners who have become so despairing that they no longer trust anyone. So I can think of one IPP prisoner, for example, who's still in prison now, but the family member don't exactly know where he is because he's just cut off all contact with everybody because he's just not prepared almost to deal with anybody now because they're all out to get him. And after so many years in prison, in one sense, you can entirely understand why someone might get into that state. And so a couple of years ago when the House of Commons Justice Committee did a review of this, and one of the witnesses said that, and he was a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and he said that in his experience dealing with IPP prisoners, they had the same kind of mental profile of individuals who were victims of a miscarriage of justice.
David Blunkett was Home Secretary when IPP was brought in, and he said it's his greatest regret. I think the government predicted about 900 people would get the sentence, but the actual figure was 10 times that. Why did they get it so wrong, and why did the numbers balloon?
Well, if you kind of think about, why the IPP was brought in. So it was brought in because the government of the day felt there were individuals who were potentially in an escalating pattern of behaviour. So maybe the first offence they've come across, the police have come across them, maybe they've, got in a fight. Second time round, the police have come across them again, and maybe they've done a robbery or something like that. So you can say, okay, first time round, it was a fight. Second time round, it's a robbery. If we don't do something about that, then maybe the third time round, they're going to kill someone, or it's going to be a very serious offence. And so the IPP was brought in supposedly to contain those kinds of people, you know, people who you think they're on an escalating pattern of behaviour, there is a triggering offence, but you've got to think, well, but we're not sure they're safe for release. Now, in principle, I mean, you know, one can have an argument about whether that's a right way of framing it, but if you think that framing is correct, in principle you can see, well, I kind of see what they're getting at. Well, how do you actually find those people? It's not like you can do brain scans, you know, or indeed you can interview the person and said, are you next time round going to do something much more serious? So you have to use a way of, as it were, capturing that cohort in a way that you think makes sense. And what they did was they effectively said, if you have a second offence of a certain nature, a certain degree of seriousness, then effectively makes you eligible for an IPP. And what happened in practice is the basket of offences, which, you know, could be used for IPP, was a very big basket. And so alongside GBH or serious acts of violence could be forms of theft, you know, forms of robbery, fighting, assaults. So quite a wide range of offences. And there was also very little discretion for judges on whether they could apply these offences. So it was a major policy failure. And ultimately, I think, if you want to kind of go back to why it was a failure, it was because the policymakers thought that it was possible. We live in a perfect world where we can have perfect knowledge and we can perfectly predict what's going to happen, and we can use these tools to identify that group and effectively get ahead of the problem, because we're going to contain them before they commit these serious offences. And of course, we don't live in a perfect world. We don't have perfect knowledge. Human relationships are complex and messy. Some individuals will go from having no contact to the police to murdering someone. Other people can have a number of quite serious offences, but then not do anything else. And so it really tested the assumption that we could somehow predict particular activities by particular individuals. And it was found, you know, very badly wanting as a philosophy and as approach.
So they were kind of predicting future crimes, basically.
Yes, or not so much predicting future crimes, but having a belief that we know who the criminals are, we can identify them, and we can intervene in such a way to stop them being future criminals of more serious offences. And it was bonkers, of course, and at the time they were warned about this, and it also became very clear very quickly. So the former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, when he gave evidence to the House of Commons Justice Committee inquiry into IPP, he was saying that he was going and visiting prisons within about 6 or 8 months of the sentence coming into force in 2005, and he said you could already see there was a problem. You could already see people who had committed maybe a string of slightly annoying offences for sure, and a nuisance offences, but nothing particularly serious, and they're in prison effectively on a life sentence.
So how difficult is it for these prisoners who are in on an IPP to access the intervention and say, I feel I'm eligible for release now?
Well, it probably won't come as a surprise to many of your viewers that prisons are in something of a state at the moment. They're very overcrowded. There is a massive backlog of maintenance, so many of the cells in the prisons more broadly are in a terrible state, infested with rats and cockroaches. Prisoners held in their cells for many, many hours. I mean, 22, 23 hours in 24. So already those prisons are in a very, very difficult state. You then have a group of prisoners, the IPP prisoners, who kind of don't really fit into any particular category. They're not life sentence prisoners, technically, so they don't have historically had that kind of regime progression, but they're also not the kinds of prisoners who are in for a couple of years and then come what may are going to be released because their sentence has come to an end. And in addition, a lot of them are not in the prisons where they might be able to access the courses to somehow demonstrate their safe release. And the courses themselves, frankly, half the time are not very good. And so they're kind of doing these courses and then they're going back to the parole board. The parole board is the body that decides on people's release. And they're going to the parole board and the parole board are saying, well, we know you've done that course, but we still don't believe that you're safe for release. And so there's a bit of crystal ball gazing going on. Finally, of course, there is then what happens when they come out into the community, if indeed they can. And one of the problems with IPP prisoners, and this is a problem for prisoners more generally, is the quality of the services and support for prisoners coming out of prison is often very poor. Not because the probation or service is doing a bad job, they are very overstretched, they're very under-resourced. And so it's also difficult for prisoners to demonstrate they have a stable, secure, meaningful resettlement approach for them when they come out. So it's a bit of a kind of a perfect storm. It's a sentence which should never have been on the statute books, that the government of the day, then and now, refuses to take off the statute books finally in terms of getting rid of this cohort once and for all. Working around within a prison system which is in complete crisis, which is frankly just managing from day to day. And so the idea in that context that prisons can be sensible or healthy places where individuals can access the services and support they need in order to get on with the rest of their lives is frankly laughable.
You talked about this cohort who go back out into the community and then they can just get recalled and they haven't committed any further offences. It's quite hard to comprehend that. Could you just explain it for us and what life would be like for them?
It's important to remember that some of them will have committed offences and some of them quite serious offences. But even when you're talking about the nature of the offence, a lot of them can be quite minor. So let me give you an example. I came across a case fairly recently of a IPP prisoner who had been released. He was living in the community and he was recalled to custody, as it's called. He was sent back to prison under an assault charge. So assault, it sounds quite serious, but actually what was going on there was he was at a family gathering. He and his brother got into a bit of an argument, as sometimes happens between brothers. It got a bit physical. They had a fight in the garden, at which point the neighbour called the police. The police turned up, calmed it all down, and everyone agreed there'd just been a bit too much drink, just a bit too much, brotherly rivalry perhaps. And the police went away, but they then punched his details, everyone's details, into the police computer, and it came up that one of these individuals was a released IPP prisoner. And that was enough to trigger his being returned to custody. So something which was effectively a bit of a domestic incident became a trigger for someone being recalled to custody. In other cases, it can be relatively minor things. It can be missing a string of appointments with the probation service, which clearly can be a concern because, if you're not in contact with the probation service, that could be an indicator that there is something awry. But, I came across another case of an ex-released prisoner, IPP prisoner, who was in a probation hostel and actually had previously had Valium, but he'd run out of Valium and he didn't have a prescription currently for Valium. So one of the other people in the hostel gave him, you can have one of my Valium tablets. That was enough to get him recalled to custody because he was taking an illegal drug. Another case of an IPP prisoner who was finding it very difficult to adjust to life outside, as a lot of prisoners, particularly when they've been in prison for a long time, find. And he told his probation officer, I'm struggling a bit here. I'm really finding it very difficult. My mental health isn't very good at the moment. That was enough to get him recalled to prison because he was deemed to have an escalating risk because he had admitted that his mental health was not very good. So the tragedy here is that it's not that probation officers are recalling prisoners to custody out of some kind of caprice or because, I've just had a bad day, I'm going to take it out on you and recall you to prison for some ridiculous reason. They are actually following the policy, and there was some research done just last year on this by the probation inspectorate who said, these people are being recalled to prison in line with the policy. My answer to that is, well, there is something going very wrong with the policy, because policies are made by people and people are perfectly capable of building the wrong policies with the wrong outcomes. And I think this is probably an example of that.
Just thinking as well for these people who are recalled, some of them won't have family and they'll be home in their family life. And at any moment, most likely the father could just be taken away to prison for no reason.
Well, one of the great injustices, I think, of the IPP sentence is the very long period where you are subject to licence post-release. So what that means in plain English is you get released from prison, but then you are subject to forms of supervision and potentially at risk of recall to prison for many, many years. So until relatively recently, it was 10 years. At the end of 10 years, once you'd been released from prison, you could apply to have your licence terminated.
Right.
It's been changed recently, actually, it was legislation that the outgoing Conservative government introduced and the now Labour government are implementing, which means that in most cases the licence will be around 3 years, maybe up to 5 years, at which point the licence should be cancelled. So simply by reducing the number of years that you're subject to post-release supervision will reduce the numbers being recalled unnecessarily. And the estimate is that will benefit maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people in the community who will no longer be subject to those kinds of strict licence conditions. And the reason why that's important is because probably, I mean, I don't know about you, but I think about my life. If a probation officer or a police officer was regularly checking up on me, eventually he's probably going to find me doing something I shouldn't be doing. Yeah, so the mere act of supervision can itself be a cause for people being returned to prison, even if actually what they were doing was frankly relatively minor in the grander scheme of things. So the reduction of the licence period will have an effect, but in and of itself it won't be enough because you still have that shadow hanging over you. And one of the real problems for released prisoners, not just IPP prisoners, but all prisoners, trying to get on with the rest of your life with the kind of, looking over your shoulder, wondering, is that knock on the door actually the police taking me back to custody? Wrecks family relationships. Obviously, it can wreck your job prospects. It can wreck your housing prospects and a whole range of things. So, the system has a great way of creating its own workload and its own, prisoners and prospective prisoners. And one of the ways it does it is through that recycling effect of recall, which has profound impact on prisoners and ex-prisoners, of course, because they constantly feel they're, wondering what that next knock on the door signifies.
Yeah. You mentioned the difficulties our prison system is experiencing. What's stopping the government from just ending this?
That is a really good question. And, if anybody, I think, could come up with a comprehensive explanation for that, then I think that would be interesting. The official line from the government is that they don't want to second guess the decision of the parole board. So when you are serving an IPP, in order to get released, you have to go to something called the parole board, who are a group of experts who will decide whether you should be released. And the government will say, well, if we, let's say, just legislated to release everybody, then we are second guessing the role of the parole board. We are just deciding as Parliament that we can just circumvent the parole board process. Well, that does happen. It's happened recently with the post office workers, for example, where Parliament basically passed some legislation saying we're effectively going to expunge all those offences that the postmasters and postmistresses were convicted of because we just decided those convictions were not safe. So Parliament can actually override legal processes and sometimes do, and that's a good example. But the government say they don't want to do it in this case. Well, again, that would only apply then to maybe those prisoners who've never been released. But that 1,000 to 1,500 or more prisoners who've been recalled to custody, they've already gone through the parole board process. They've already been deemed safe for release. So in principle, you could just resentence those, or you could just remove the IPP from them. But the government say they won't do it. They'll also say, well, it's public protection. If we did that, then all these people are going to be released straight away. Well, then you phase the release. You make sure you've got effective release plans in place to make sure that people are properly supervised and supported. I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to just some fairly base politics that it's in the grander scheme of things, it's just not a big deal. Right. It's 2,000 to 3,000 people, in the context of a government that's wrestling with a crisis in the NHS, major international uncertainty and conflicts, a transport system that's not in a good state, a social care system that's a disaster zone, schools that have a number of problems. The problems of 2,000 to 3,000 prisoners is kind of, in the grander scheme of things, neither here nor there for, when you're sat in Downing Street with your grid. And I think the other thing, of course, is it's potentially quite politically toxic because, you take ambitious action on this issue. Well, the first time that any released IPP prisoner does anything more significant than jumping a bus queue, and the tabloids are going to be all over it, and it's going to be a political crisis for the Secretary of State, who's going to have to justify why they took this issue. So I think ultimately it's probably a bit of, just why is this such a big deal? And frankly, some base political judgments that it's just too hot to handle. So let's just run the clock down on it. Let's just, eventually it's going to go away because eventually these people are going to be released, or frankly, they're going to die in custody, or it becomes somebody else's problem, several years down the line.
Can you also just talk to us a bit about the state of our prisons and help us understand that?
Well, I mean, the prisons overall are in a pretty dire state, although, it's a bit of a mixture. There are some, particularly some of the older prisons, which are particularly in poor repair. There are some newer prisons which are, in a better state, although even then, a lot of them have been built quite quickly, maybe not with the kind of the best, construction standards. So even then, they can look a bit kind of, rough around the edges. But they're also very overcrowded. So, last summer, we got very close to bust point in the prisons where they literally would have run out of space. And that's why the government took that emergency action in the lingo called SDS 40, stands for Standard Determinate Sentence 40, which meant that for people who are not on, let's say, an IPP sentence, so on what's called a determinate sentence, you're sent to prison for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, you get out. Well, actually, in practice, if you're sent to prison for 2 years, you're going to get out after about 8 months or 8 or 9 months because you serve 40% of your sentence in prison and the rest of the term you serve in the community under supervision. So the government had to take those steps because if they hadn't done so, the prison population, they would have literally run out of space to hold people. So they're in a very, very poor state of repair. They're very, very overcrowded. There aren't enough staff, and the staff there are often not very experienced or qualified, often are quite young. It's quite scary for them, actually. And so it's, it's just pretty poor. It's pretty bad, and it's bad for prisoners being held in these kinds of conditions, but it's also bad for prison staff having to work in those conditions. I myself try not to go to prisons very often because I always find them just on a personal level really difficult. They're really sad places. They're very depressing places to be, and they're difficult places to work. And I've got huge admiration for prison officers because I think they do a very, very difficult job in a way that's often not really recognised. It's certainly not recognised in terms of paying conditions. It's quite a dangerous job. It's quite a difficult job. Sure, there are some really bad prison officers who actually abuse their position, but there's lots of really, really good prison officers, and they're doing a very, very good job in very, very difficult circumstances. So yeah, I think something needs to change. Back about 10 or 15 years ago, 3 former Home Secretaries, including Conservative Home Secretaries, wrote to the Times newspaper and said, we need to get the prison population back to the level it was under Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. So to put that in context, we currently have about over 80,000 people in prison in England and Wales. When Margaret Thatcher was in power, not exactly a shrinking violet or a kind of a lily-livered liberal by any means, the prison population was about 40,000. So there's been an enormous growth of the prison population over the last 20 or 30 years, and it's a real problem because at the end of the day, if you just keep cramming people into overcrowded buildings which are in very, very poor state of repair, you're not going to get good outcomes, are you?
What do you think are the best changes we could make to our kind of criminal justice system to improve this?
Well, I think there's a few things that need to change. I mean, I think there are some things like, for example, the IPP prisoners, where the government just needs to sort this out. They just need to kind of grow the cojones to just do it, you know, and that would actually free up 2,000 to 3,000 places if they did it quickly, which is equivalent to about 4 medium-sized prisons. So it's not a small number of people. So just on pragmatic grounds, that we should be doing something about that. I think we should also be looking very much at the question of recall. So again, that's what happens when someone's released from prison. They do something, whether they commit a new offence or not, or something else. They breach the terms of their release and they get sent back to prison. Now, back in the early mid-90s, there were, we don't exactly know because the data wasn't as reliable then, but the best estimate is there were probably fewer than 100 people in prison at any one point under recall. That's 100 people or under, fewer than 100 people. There's now over 12,000.
Really?
And that's not because prisoners have become somehow worse or more bad or anything. It's because the changes in the policies around recall have dramatically increased the numbers being returned to custody. So, you know, again, you can do the maths on that. If, you know, roughly 3,000 prisoners is about 4 medium-sized prisons, you can do the maths on what 12,000 prisoners are. So I think we should be doing something about recall. We should be doing something about remand, because there's a lot of prisoners who spend many months, if not sometimes years, in prison on remand. So remand is what happens when you're awaiting trial. You've been charged with an offence, you're sent to prison because you're deemed not to be safe, to live in the community, awaiting trial, then you go to trial. And of course, sometimes these individuals will be acquitted or found not guilty. So they've then spent, a year or 2 years in prison, and they're innocent. Or sometimes the time they've spent on remand awaiting their trial has been so long that maybe they've spent 2 years in prison, they get a 4-year sentence, well, they're released straight away because, you know, they've served their time on remand. So the remand situation is a real mess. It grew under lockdown, but it's still very high, and that needs to be sorted out. And then I think there are particular cohorts that we should be looking at. We should be looking at, you know, women. You know, frankly, if prison is there for individuals who are a threat to the public or a danger to the public, you maybe would have, 100 women in prison, I'm going to say, just as a, you know, ballpark figure. We currently have about 3,500 to 4,000. Many of them have quite significant mental health problems. They have drug problems. Many women in prison have had appalling experiences of male sexual and other violence. Indeed, it is a kind of a commonplace that most women in prison are in prison because of the men in their lives. And again, that could be sorted out, in principle, relatively easily, where we could just have a general policy of not imprisoning women. You know, we have 600 pregnant women or so are sent to prison every year. What on earth are we doing, sending pregnant women to prison? So I think women, I think young people, again, is another area we could be looking at. So it's not any one area. I think there's a number of different things, but underlying all of that also is sentencing, which has grown in length significantly. So if you or I were, you know, goodness, God help us, committed a murder, you know, now we might expect a life sentence of 20 to 25 years in prison before we would be eligible for release. And indeed, some prisoners, you have what's called the whole life tariff, where they're never going to be released. Had we committed the same offence, say, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe we'd have got 10 years in prison before we'd be eligible for release. And one of the we've seen across the board is just sentences getting longer and longer and longer and longer for the same offences. And that's a significant feature behind the current problems we have in prison, because it's not just that people find it difficult to get out, they can't prove they're safe for release, but they're just being sent to prison for much, much longer periods of time.
Why is that?
Well, it's a number of changes to legislation that have introduced mandatory minimum sentences. So if you kill someone with a knife now, the starting point for that is 25 years, the starting point. And I was in a prison, it was a couple of years ago now, where I got talking to a young man who had been in prison by that stage for, I think, probably about 5 years. He was on a 30-year sentence for killing someone with a knife. And it was a very sad case in many ways. He didn't disagree, he'd done what he'd been found guilty of. But he was a Pakistani man. He'd been subject to just targeted racial abuse and assaults by basically a white gang. And he'd taken to carrying a knife for his own protection. And you can imagine what happened next time the gang attacked him. So it was, you know, a very sad and tragic case. But, you know, 30 years from his point of view, defending himself from a racist gang. He would also acknowledge he shouldn't have done what he did. But, you know, people do all sorts of silly and bad things without thinking them through. So changes in legislation, changes in the kind of, you know, the public dialogue and discourse and politicisation of, you know, around crime and justice, which has meant that politicians have been trying to outdo themselves. It's a range of reasons. But the kind of the interesting fact out of all of this is we are currently sending far fewer people to prison. So compared with about a decade ago, we're sending about 30,000 people less to prison each year.
Really?
But what's happening is we are sending to prison, we're sending for longer and longer and longer. So had we been sending the same number of people to prison now as we were, you know, 10, 12, 15 years ago, we'd probably have a prison population maybe double what it currently is. I haven't done the maths on that, would just be my rough guess. So funnily enough, the decline in the numbers being sent to prison has been the one saving grace, because it has meant that as sentences have got longer and longer, the prison population hasn't grown anywhere like as much as it otherwise could have done.
Richard Garside, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.